Welcome to another episode of Disrupting Divorce. And today we are going to be talking about parenting, high conflict parenting. And I have an expert who has joined the podcast, Huntoon. Thank you so much for joining me today. So, one of the questions that I often ask to kick off our time together is, what are you doing to disrupt divorce?
Well, thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate it. What I do is I focus on what I think is a blind spot, and I get a lot of consensus around me in terms of addressing high conflict and separation divorce, specifically around custody. So the blind spot is that so often when there seems to be a high conflict dynamic, it's really more one of the co-parents who is driving the conflict and the other parent who's responding to it. And the blind spot is not just that dynamic exists, but what to do about it, how to discern whether that's going on and how to address it, how to intervene. And so that's a focus of a lot of my work. I write a lot. I work with clients who are in this situation. So that's the way I am trying to kind of positively influence how people see that kind of custody conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, talk to us a little bit about, let's just lay the framework. So, what prompted you to start doing some of this work and specializing in this particular area?
Prior to what I'm doing now, really was my last full-time job. I worked as a custody mediator for the local district court. I worked in family court. I answered to the chief district judge. I worked with two other mediators in an office. I'm in North Carolina, and by law, all the custody cases need to go through mediation with a very few exceptions. So I did that for 8.5 years. It was high volume, like an assembly line, scheduling, a dozen mediations a week and conducting about 8 of them. So I saw around a couple thousand cases in 8.5 years, a lot. And I started noticing something. It took me a little while. I didn't catch on right away, but I started noticing something, get into mediation. And one person would look very reasonable, very rational around custody. And the other person would often become very frustrated. So at first you'd think, oh, it's the reasonable person. They want a solution here. They want to reach some sort of resolution for their children. But then once you got into it, 20 minutes, half an hour, you could see, oh, I was so wrong. The person who's frustrated, they're frustrated for a reason because the other parent is presenting in a certain way, but they're really the one who's driving the conflict.
Mm.
And so I started thinking about that and noticing it more and more and talking with my colleagues about it. I retired and I did some retirement things for a while, but a few months after I retired, I came back to this issue and started getting into co-parenting coaching. I worked with a couple of local law firms with referrals. I started working with clients. And then I saw this dynamic again. The first two cases that I got referred to by law firms had elements of this asymmetric custody conflict. And the first two cases, one of the parents was a responding parent. The other parent was really driving a lot of the conflict. And in the other case, it was the parent who was driving the conflict. And she came to me really hoping to kind of influence, or if I want to be blunt about it, manipulate the other parent into doing what she thought he should do. And in both those cases, I talked to both of the parents. Only one of the parents was a client, but I was able to talk with both parents, which is really important to get both perspectives. And it confirmed my thinking. And so then I started writing about it. And the more I wrote about it, the more response I got. People connect with people all over the world. In May, I'm going to be presenting at the annual meeting of the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts with two people from Australia, a custody evaluator and a judge. So it is almost universal that people recognize this pattern. But
Yeah.
up until recently, there hasn't been much language around it. There hasn't been much exploration of the dynamics that cause it.
Yeah. I think as you're talking and as we've had conversations leading up to the podcast interview, one of the things that I think is really refreshing is the fact that when I think about what you're disrupting, this disruption of highlighting an area that I know there's a lot of women that are listening to this podcast that are like, finally somebody who's telling it like it is, because I've been in these mediations before with my client and the attorney, and you have the mediator who's, bopping back and forth. This is more of an attorney assisted style, not court ordered. But at the end of the day, the person who's like getting fired up and feeling emotional and frustrated ends up looking like the crazy person. But what people don't realize is A, that's usually a lot of trauma, and B, it's because they've been talking softly and quietly and calmly, and nobody's listening to them. And they get louder and louder and louder and more frustrated because their kids are on the line, right? I feel like if it was them, only them, they probably would be less boisterous, right? And so I love the work that you're doing. I think the work that you saw working with the court systems directly, I think there's a lot of people that would benefit from taking a step back, looking at the dynamics, probably reading some of the articles that you have put out to say, listen, this is a real problem. So it's refreshing to hear. Along those lines, so for the women that are listening that are like, okay, yep, Al, you are speaking to me. I think the question is, what are some things that they can do? Because I'm all about practical, right? What are some practical things that women could do if they find themselves in a spot where they feel like there is this asymmetrical parenting happening?
Well, one thing I just want to respond to what you said is about the high stakes. Like, that's something being in a room with people, there were no attorneys. It was just myself and the parents or the caregivers, and there might have been third party cases, but most of the cases, it was me sitting 3, 4 feet away from two parents. And they're talking about the thing that they cared most about in the whole world. And so the stakes were very, very high for them. And so, of course, you're going to respond to that emotionally. You should. That's a natural thing to do. So, what I work with people around, the approach that I take is focusing on two things. One thing is on emotional literacy, and people also think of this as emotional intelligence. I like to think of it more as literacy because literacy is a skill that people can learn, right? And as you build your literacy, you expand that skill and it gives you access to more information.
Mm-hmm.
So, emotional literacy, being aware of your emotional responses, understanding that you're not your emotions, okay? Emotions are not weather that is happening to you. Emotions are being evoked because of your values, and you're kind of a space where the emotions are happening. And so that gives you some leverage to manage your emotions, to stop, understand what you're feeling, think about why you're feeling it. And the other part of that is intentionality, right? So you want to think about your dynamic, think about your emotional responses, and respond very intentionally, not reactively. Those are the two things. I mean, it's hard to do, but it's simple to understand. Those are the two things that I work with people on. One of the things that people get frustrated, and I have a client I've been working with a long time. When I first started working with her, she wanted a cooperative co-parenting relationship with her ex and their two young children, 3 and 1.5. And she really wanted that badly, and her intentions were the best. At first, we were working along those lines. How can she invite him into more cooperative relationship? What could she do? And then over time, it was very clear that it was not possible for him, at this time anyway, to have that kind of cooperative relationship. He just was not collaboration minded. It wasn't geared toward that. And working with people like that in the situations that I'm discussing, it really helped me have some insight. What became clear is for her interactions, her dynamic was a system that included herself, her kids, and her ex. Her ex's system included one person, himself. He had kind of an empathy deficit. He couldn't really think about how this was affecting his kids and how this was affecting their mother. He mostly focused on himself. Now, a lot of people, we hear this a lot in our business, is that label him as narcissistic. But I think basically he was emotionally immature. And that shows up as self-centeredness, self-centered language, self-centered behavior. But really what it shows is emotional immaturity and inability to really empathize beyond himself, empathize with his kids, especially, but also with their mother. So that helped us, my client and I, to understand what was going on and to respond more effectively to it.
Yeah.
And she's not nearly as frustrated as she used to be. And we still meet about once a month. She's in a much better situation than she was. And that really made a difference.
Yeah, I love that. I know one of the assessments we do with our clients or prospective clients is something called the financial personality. And one of the
Hmm.
resulting characteristics, there's like 5 different personalities, but one of them is financially collaborative, right? And I
Hmm.
think when you're talking, that's kind of what it reminds me of because people that are naturally collaborative, whether it's we're talking around the financials or around the kids, they long for being able to work together as a team. A lot of times they don't necessarily need to be in charge, but they definitely want that camaraderie. They feel like by giving more, they're going to get more in exchange for that. And it just becomes extremely frustrating. And so I think the awareness that you and your client had is essential to be able to say, okay, now we have some more clarity of what's actually going on. How do we strategize and move forward? But I think women a lot of times get stuck in feeling like collaborating is the better option. And sometimes it's just not possible.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you say that because I talk in financial terms sometimes. I talk about emotional exchanges as being transactional. And when they're mutually beneficial, is there's the mutuality in the exchange. That is like a business basis, right? I go into a store, I give you my money, I get something, we're both happy, right? We don't have to be friends. I don't leave there necessarily making a new friend. I might, but I go into Starbucks, I give them, my money and I get a cup of coffee. And at the end of the day, we're both happy. That's a transactional basis. But what happens when someone is really driving conflict is they impose a kind of emotional tax on the other person by overstepping boundaries, by making unreasonable demands, threatening litigation, actually following through with it, having a partnership with their attorney if there's ongoing litigation or threats of it. That all can impose a high emotional cost on the other parent. And so it's very helpful to think in terms of the financial aspects, the transactions, the exchanges, the taxes that people levy on other people. So kind of like an everyday way to understand how these emotional exchanges work. And I think then translating that into a more emotional framework for people is helps because we aren't emotionally all that literate in our culture. And having those kinds of metaphors for those exchanges really helps.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other part of it too is understanding, right, how people are wired. And I love the literacy component because I do think there's a lot of opportunity for learning around how we handle conflict. I had early on in my career, I had participated in a conference and there were 22 other women there. And what we were looking at was being assertive. And what we found through this analysis of this group, kind of like think of it like a mini mastermind, mini cohort group, is that a very small percentage actually were collaborative as kids. And so if we looked at like an assertive, so if you weren't assertive as a kid, what was the dynamics? Was one parent assertive and one wasn't? Were both parents assertive? Were they passive? We went through this whole analysis. But after kind of taking a look, just one of the 22 people, women, successful business owners that were in the room could say that they were assertive as a kid and assertive as an adult. And yet you had a good portion of the women in that room that were either assertive or on their way to becoming more assertive, right? As since it is a process. But
Mhm.
I left there to your point, Al, feeling like felt so encouraged. Like, oh my gosh, this isn't just either you're assertive or you're not. Oh, this is a skill I can learn. Oh, this is going to be helpful for me. And now today, I mean, I'm only assertive. Like I mastered that skill, but it was because I had an awareness that it was possible for me to learn it.
I think that's really important. That's a startling result, isn't it? One out of 22 women consider themselves assertive. And the thing is that if you're not assertive, if you don't have good boundaries, you can't really be collaborative. I think that's something that people don't realize. I grew up in the 60s in a neighborhood with tons of kids. So there were all these learning opportunities for us to cooperate. If we didn't cooperate, we weren't playing baseball or tag or whatever it was. And you learn to be assertive. But the other thing about that was who I hung around with was all boys, right? And so I don't know what the girls were doing, but they probably didn't have access to the same kind of learning experience. Yeah, that's probably true. And I'm not trying to make a broad generalization, but I think in general that's true. And I think also women are much more sensitive to kind of the social implications of their
Yeah.
behavior, right? In a way that men aren't. So I think there's an element there of that. But I think it's so important to understand that assertiveness comes from understanding where your boundaries are and kind of trusting yourself that the way I think of boundaries are not limits on other people. They're limits on ourselves. They're self discipline. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to respond in this way. That's a boundary. A limit is I'm not going to let you do something. That's the difference between being assertive, right? These are my boundaries, and I trust myself to protect my boundaries, and aggressive. You can't do something. That's what I think a lot of people have a hard time tipping from being assertive into being aggressive. And I think a key to that is understanding the difference between having boundaries for yourself and limiting other people's behavior. And I see that so much with custody orders or parenting plans that are misinterpreted because they're vague, or because one of the things that people who drive conflict do is they exploit ambiguity in agreements or orders. I see it all the time.
I think that's definitely an area where there's an opportunity for more detail to get dialed in. I know there's a lot of times where the attorneys want to kind of shy away from that because they don't want it to be so limiting, right? But to your point, and I see this all the time in the work that I'm doing as well, is the more detail, the more structure that you can give, that is helpful. And actually, I mean, a lot of times these situations are only impacted if they can't come up with an agreement on their own, then that becomes kind of like the default. It's not like, meant to be iron fist and the hammer. It's meant to be a guideline, and you hit it exactly. I mean, again, I know that a lot of what you're saying is resonating because so many of the women are like, "Oh my gosh, like if we don't have these details put in here, he will take advantage of the ambiguity and create more issues, more problems, more challenges down the road."
Well, as a custody mediator working for the court, I wrote hundreds of custody orders. They were reviewed by people, by their attorneys if they had them, and always by a judge who signed them. And so what I would say that the level of detail has to be balanced against the level of conflict. You don't want to handcuff people who are cooperative. And so in those cases, you want to include language that encourages cooperation, right? If you both agree, you can do this. And that's another reason, another incentive for people to really understand what kind of conflict is happening between the two co parents. Is it mutual, or is one of the parents driving the conflict? A lot of people talk about parallel parenting, and I think that is important remedy for people who are in conflict situations. But I've also seen it really kind of penalize someone who is being more responsive, a protective parent who is being more responsive to conflict. It really, in a lot of ways, tied their hands in a way that I think was necessary. So that's why I think it's important for professionals to really understand that not all high conflict is mutual. That I think most of it isn't mutual. I think whatever level of conflict, it's usually one of the parents who's driving it. How to discern when that's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if they discern it, I know we've kind of talked a lot about some options. It's making sure that they're aware, right? That their strategy is based on information that, hey, we now have a new level of awareness of what's going on. And that's going to kind of direct the strategy moving forward on how they respond, making sure that there's detail, the level of detail in the final agreement that's in alignment with the level of conflict. Any other strategies or tips that you think would be helpful for our listeners here today?
That's a great question. I think I would just reemphasize I think the most important thing that I can stress for people is emotional literacy. Whether or not you're in a high conflict situation with your co parent or your ex, it's going to benefit you in all the areas of your life. So I'd say that's the most important thing to focus on. but especially if you're in a high conflict situation with your ex or your co-parent. That's just key to understanding how your emotions work, what emotion you're feeling, right? And why emotions are important. But what the most important thing is to be intentional and strategic in that situation. So often, I'm guilty of myself. So often I see something, text especially, something about text creates an urgency in people and they're responding right away. Take a breath, pause, come up with some alternatives, do something counterintuitive. My response is angry. What's the opposite of that? Right? Consider alternatives before you respond, especially if you're in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And, thankfully, there are some really great apps and tools now that are taking some of the guesswork out of that, right? That you can use to be able to craft a message that feels
Absolutely.
less emotionally charged. Because in that moment, right, it can be hard. And so, yeah, taking a minute, gathering our thoughts, but also realizing you don't necessarily have to be coming up with something from scratch. There might be an app or a tool available that you can leverage to be able to come up with that and then customize it for your own.
Absolutely. I'm going to plug my book because one of the tools is AI, and it's so easy to access and use. It's just all over the place. All you have to do is be able to use type. You can just talk to it and you can try out different messages. You can get advice. It's great. And so I wrote a book about that. It's more like a manual. Your co-parenting co-pilot. You can find it on Amazon. And it's because my very first client talked about using AI to craft some responses in email to his other co-parents. So it started me thinking. I went through a lot of different scenarios and I outlined those in the book.
Awesome. I love that. I love that. Well, we have covered a lot of ground in a really short period of time, but as we wrap up, Al, any final words of encouragement that you want to share with our listeners today?
So I think if you're going through this, it might be the toughest thing you've ever faced in your life. I know that for sure. As a social worker for over 30 years, I've been in some heartbreaking situations. But that can really be the most challenging thing you've ever faced. And what I tell people is you can rise to the challenge. It's evoking as your most vulnerable self, but you have another self available, which is your strongest self, right? Your best self. And if you think about both of those things are available to me, am I going to respond for my most vulnerable self or am I going to respond for my best self, especially for my kids? You can do that. It's very challenging, but you can do that and there's lots of people who will support you in that.
Yeah, I love that. It is definitely an opportunity for transformation. I know that when I started my business, one of the things I said is if I can help one woman improve her relationship with money, I've helped her improve that for a lifetime. And I think that's absolutely spot on. So grateful for our time together today. And certainly we'll include the link to your book in the show notes if our listeners would like to check it out. And I want to thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you for the conversation. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed it.